Mr. Mayor, we are ready for you.
All right, I will call this City Council meeting, both workshop and business meeting, to order. City Recorder Krager, please call roll.
Councilor Shaw.
Here.
Mayor Snyder.
Here.
Youth Councilor Calderon.
Here.
Councilor Goodhouse.
Here.
Councilor Newton.
Here.
Council President Lee.
Here.
All right, thank you. Let's move to the Pledge of Allegiance. Keelan, would you mind putting the flag up, and I'll ask everyone to mute themselves and participate on your own. All right, staff or council have any non-agenda items?
Mr. Mayor, staff do not have any non-agenda items this evening.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to item number 2, which is a legislative public hearing considering an ordinance amending Tigard Municipal Code Chapter 6.02 related to pedestrian easements. I will first start by opening the public hearing. Anyone that wants to offer testimony will be allowed to do so. Written comments were due by 4:30 p.m. this afternoon, and those wishing to testify via phone can call 503-966-4101 and be put in the queue. City Attorney Rahala, staff report.
Good evening, Council. So currently in our municipal code, sidewalks are the responsibility of the adjacent property owners. And so that is for maintenance purposes and liability. We do not have anything in our code about pedestrian easements. And pedestrian easements are generally used by commercial developments or subdivisions to connect developments. So staff is proposing to treat pedestrian easements the same as sidewalks. The purpose of this is not only to further the city's strategic plan in terms of encouraging connectivity, but also to eliminate the staff work that is presented by having to negotiate each of these easements separately. So right now, when a large developer comes to the city, we end up trying to negotiate who has maintenance responsibilities. The city does not have the staff or resources available to maintain all of these. And so it creates an inequitable situation with the developers who are able to afford attorneys and able to negotiate, as opposed to a smaller developer. It creates an incentive to try to negotiate against the city, to try to get the city to take on the maintenance responsibilities. And as we continue to encourage these types of easements, the number is increasing. And so the staff role, we're spending a lot more time on these. So the proposal tonight is just to treat these exactly the same as sidewalks for purposes of maintenance. So that would be things like snow removal, debris removal, cracks, so that the city does not have to maintain those. And then also, if there were to be some sort of injury on one of these pedestrian sidewalks, that the city would be held not responsible for that. So it already exists for sidewalks, and this is just making it the same for pedestrian easements around the city. So I can answer any questions.
And we should keep it to questions at this point, I think. Councillor Newton?
Yes, just for point of clarification, thanks, City Attorney Rahala. These easements remain on private property, I'm assuming, and the sidewalks are in the public right-of-way. And the sidewalk in front of my house, when I bought my house, the sidewalk was there and I'm responsible. And so are we negotiating, are we requesting these pedestrian easements? and then we're asking them to maintain them. I'm just wondering how it will work in terms of, the requirement we're putting on a private property owner for an easement on their property in terms of negotiating with them to get the easement in the first place. Am I making sense?
Right. So I think and the question. And there's an okay. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
I understand the question. Yes. So typically, these sorts of easements are negotiated to satisfy a code requirement for connectivity or to get some other development advantage. And so we have one that we're negotiating right now where we allowed them to do a pedestrian easement in lieu of other transportation development standards. And so there is a benefit to the property owner in being able to meet our code requirements or being able to do something that they otherwise would have to do, being able to avoid that.
Council President Lube, you are still muted.
Thank you. I think that's the first time I've actually done that in a meeting. So thank you. Sort of to piggyback off of Councilor Newton's question, I'm wondering just about just the general foot traffic and the burden it would place, because initially we're talking with developers about this easement, but eventually it's going to go to a community member who buys this property, and I'm wondering what sort of additional burden it places them, just if there's additional traffic and what that might look like.
Yeah, so there is additional traffic because that is the purpose of these, is to encourage neighborhood connectivity. These easements are generally on large developments though, so this is not that I as a resident am granting an easement. These are attaching large subdivisions or large commercial properties with multifamily or office. And so the easements that I've been aware of have been much larger developments, and they serve a much larger, the easement is a benefit to the property owner as well, again, because they can avoid meeting some other requirement. And so these are generally large. I'm trying to think of some of the places. We have one along 99W that we're negotiating. We've had one in the Tiger Triangle, kind of where the intersection.
Shelby, if they're in subdivisions, as you're answering this, if they're in subdivisions, don't those eventually go to individuals, or do they go to an HOA? Or when you say that, what are you quite meaning by that when you're answering Councilor Lube's question?
Yeah, so generally, if it's a subdivision, it would go to the HOA because these are typically, for the subdivisions, they are typically the HOA-owned property, the public property. I would say most of them that I've been involved with have been on commercial properties, though.
Okay. I have one other question. How does this impact the previous agreements? Does this change previous agreements, or is this just every agreement moving forward?
So it would be every agreement moving forward, or it would fill in a gap in the absence of clearly stated responsibilities. And so, for example, sometimes easements are done as plat notes, which if you look at the drawing of a plat is just literally a little number next to it, and it says public pedestrian easement for the benefit of the city. And so in that case, it's dedicated to the city, but there's nothing on the plat that says anything about responsibility or liability. And so in the absence of any statement, it would fill in the gap. Where we have previously agreed to maintain, we would continue to do so.
Perfect. Thank you.
So in those situations, Shelby, that you were just describing, it's kind of ambiguous right now. Is that the way you would describe it?
Exactly. Yes. And just due to resources, it's the city's position that we are not responsible. But again, it's ambiguous because there's nothing to clarify that.
Councilor Shaw.
Thank you, Mayor. Director Wahala, do we know how many residences would be impacted? Do you have any idea?
No, I do not. I would have to check that. But again, it would be the HOA as a whole and not the individual property owners.
All right, I'm going to move us on. We'll have time to discuss and consider in a moment, but let's get public testimony in. Is there, I don't think I saw any written public testimony. City Recorder Krager, is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay, and Mr. Clary, do we have any callers in the queue?
There are no callers in the queue.
All right, no staff response to testimony. I will close the public hearing and we'll move on to council consideration of ordinance number 21-03. So I'm going to just, since I didn't ask any questions, I guess I'll start by just making something between a statement and a question. City Attorney Rahala, I guess when I'm thinking about some of these, I worry a little bit about the ones where we say a property owner is responsible for maintaining them, and like in Summerfield and certain places where the homeowner would have to walk 3/4 of a mile to even get to the site because it's out a backyard or a side yard that they don't have access out to. And I guess I'm just like, do you know of, or are you concerned about any of those sort of unintended consequences, either in older neighborhoods or situations that aren't like the ones you just described, where it's going to be overly burdensome to the homeowner?
Right. So our intention is not to make this overly burdensome. Enforcement would be through the code enforcement process, which in Tigard is complaint driven, and we are very willing to work with property owners who have this issue come up. So it's not meant to be a strong enforcement action. It's meant to make sure that when we have easements that need to be maintained, that we're clear about who maintains them. So I guess in the situation of a Summerfield, right now, in the absence of this code section, I think it's ambiguous who would be responsible. And my guess is that the property just wouldn't be maintained. So the goal of this is really to try to make sure that everybody is on a level playing field, as opposed to punish the older neighborhoods.
Well, and I'm really using the Summerfield example to talk about areas where they're supposed to maintain a sidewalk, and yet it's 3/4 of a mile for them to get to it. And then when they do get to it, or if they were to try to drive to it, it's on, Durham Road, for example, where there's not really a way to service it either. It's just sort of, it becomes a burden. I guess I just want us all thinking about that as we're thinking through this. And I was just trying to use even those sidewalk examples. I think some of these could end up the same way. Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Director Hala. Following up on a question, perhaps Councilor President Lube's question may have answered this, but existing development that has either an access easement or a conservation easement would not be, this would not affect them. And I'm thinking in particular, because I know there is some developments in Tigard that have an HOA on paper, but the HOA is not, and ostensibly it doesn't exist.
Right. Right, that would not be the case. This would only apply if the easement is dedicated to the city for pedestrian purposes. And so to go back to the mayor's question, if it's just a public path that the public has access to, it's not included in this code provision. This is only where by plat or by other agreement, the property has been dedicated to the city for this specific purpose. So it wouldn't cover a conservation easement. It wouldn't cover, sometimes we have private paths or public areas within HOAs that are typically for the benefit of that internal HOA circulation. That wouldn't be covered here either. It would just be if they are dedicated to the city.
Thank you. That's a helpful clarification for me. Other members of council have questions or comments or a motion?
Councillor Newton, I move to approve ordinance 21-3.
I second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. City Recorder, please read the number and title of the ordinance.
Ordinance number 21-03, an ordinance amending chapter 6.02 of the Tigard Municipal Code to clarify maintenance and responsibilities for public pedestrian easements.
All right, City Recorder, roll call vote, please.
Councilor Shaw,
Yes.
Mayor Snyder,
Yes.
Councilor Goodhouse,
Yes.
Councilor Newton,
Yes.
Council President Lube.
Yes.
All right, ordinance number 21-03 is adopted unanimously. Thank you very much, City Attorney Rahala. I think that is another one of the long list of issues that you're following up and cleaning up on in your time as our staff city attorney.
Indeed,
Thank you.
they just keep coming.
I know. Someday it'll end. Might be
Right.
when you're retired, but okay. Item number 3 on the agenda is to receive a update on the Parks Master Plan. Director Rager.
Good evening, Council. Brian Rager, Public Works Director. Our team is excited to be here with you tonight to give you another update of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. The timing of this update is so that you can be well prepared for your eventual meeting with the Parks and Rec Advisory Board in February. And as I said, this is our second update. If you recall, the first update was focused on physical gaps in the city. And we're trying to look at that through an equity lens. The focus of this update is also looking at gaps, but more along the lines of park condition and resources needed to improve those conditions, organizational structure for parks and recreation. Also, we'll talk a little about funding as seen through an equity lens to help ensure that there will be a high quality park and supporting recreation services within a 10-minute walk for all of our residents. Before we move to hear from our consultant, I'd like to introduce Rick Gruen. He is our new Parks, Recreation, and Green Infrastructure Manager, and he has a few comments.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. It's my pleasure to be here with the city. I'm happy to be here, and I'm attending first council meeting tonight, and very excited for you all to hear the update that Brian is our my research with the council and
Am I the only one that
the project
connection's bad?
commitment to equity in our parks.
Yeah, Mr. Gruen, we're having a lot of trouble hearing you. Like I was trying to let it go, but I don't think people can actually understand what you're trying to communicate. And I don't know if you've got a place where you can get a better connection.
Rick, you might also try turning your
now?
video off. Maybe that'll help.
Yeah, you can
Is that
certainly
a
try
little
with the
better
video
now?
off. That does sound better for now.
All right. Well, let me just suffice to say, Mr. Mayor, I'm very happy to be here and be a part of the team and part of the effort to ensure. I think our team members are on the call as well. Martin, Marissa, Kate, Carla, and of course our leader, Brian. But in the interest of time and my connection, let me introduce Alex Dupy with our MIG team and our update on the master plan. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Brian. Once again, my name's Alex Dupy. I'm with MIG and the project manager for this project. Also with me tonight is Lauren Schmidt, who's our principal in charge. I'm going to just step through some initial pieces for the presentation, and then I'll turn it over to her to talk about some of the organizational research we've been doing. A key part of this project is looking not just at parks, but also how parks are managed, including recreation components of that. And so that's a kind of a key element that we've been focusing on the last 6 weeks or so, and it'll be a large part of the work that we're doing in early 2021. Can everybody see my screen? Just to make sure it's shared. All right. So let me just step through, since the last time we, or I guess I spoke to you, it was early in the summer, and essentially with our process, we've been continuing to finish up specific tasks that ultimately will develop into the new Tigard Parks and Recreation Master Plan. And just to kind of remind you of where we're at, we've been developing a number of kind of baseline tasks as well as getting into recommendations, whether that's for the recreation system or organizational strategies. Another piece of that is actually to look at projects and how those are developed and maintained throughout the Tigard Park systems in the most equitable way possible. And that includes existing facilities, new facilities, and then facilities that are just coming online as a part of development. We are coming towards the end of this project, where we're hoping with an early spring to have a draft plan that will include recommendations that we'll be coming back to you for. So consider this tonight as an update, as well as a great opportunity to kind of see some of the work that we're doing, particularly on the organizational side. We'd love your input as we develop those recommendations moving forward. So in terms of progress, we have been we've completed a number of things. Some of these pieces are ones that we provided an update on last time, but I think it is important to consider because these do kind of start to align with some of the potential recommendations that'll be coming out in the next 6 to 8 weeks or so. We've completed a 10-minute walk analysis, which it means that we're looking at existing parks as well as trails and access to those. We've compared that to city demographics to see where there are areas that maybe have great access and nice new parks versus others that are really underserved. And when we consider that with demographics adjacent, how does that start to play out for future recommendations when we think about parks and maintenance and other things like that? We've looked at every park within your system and developed an assessment tool for that. The city is reviewing those specific elements so that we can actually start to grade some of those parks, identifying specific recommendations for each of those facilities. We completed an online survey and have done a fair bit of in-depth analysis for that. We had a large turnout over the summer for that. We left it online for quite a long time to make sure that everybody could have access, and we got great recommendations. And so as you start to see both project and system recommendations, a lot of that is the basis from that survey with the thousands of specific data points that we had. And tonight, actually, we have looked at some of the recreation program growth and staff as well, and we're continuing to do that, and actually the organizational options are some of the pieces we're going to talk about this evening. Specifically, we're looking at staffing and how a park system or parks system kind of management could be organized. We are looking at your recreation program. We know that there's a lot of growth or a lot of desired growth from what we've heard from survey and stakeholder meetings to expand the recreation program. How does that work within a system? We are looking at specific timelines and priorities for those system improvements, and then we will be going back out to the public again. We're hoping in the next 6 to 8 weeks or so with an online survey to look at specific project priorities. So what did we hear before? How have we organized that into specific buckets? What are some things that the community thinks that we should prioritize? And then ultimately develop that into a draft and final plan. So you'll be seeing us again in the coming months talking about those specific actions. Just as a reminder, when we think about the goals for this project, a lot of these are really aligned with your citywide strategic plan. To be able to have equitable access to the public facilities and spaces within Tigard is an important element of that. And when I talk about kind of that baseline analysis we did from the 10-minute walk analysis, how accessible are these spaces, and when they get there, what quality of spaces are they? What types of services and amenities do they provide? How are they maintained? Are there others that are maintained really well because they're new, or they have some type of development agreement, or are they older and need a little bit more love? And so those are the types of things that we're looking at and are a goal of this project. The other piece is to really look at those recreation services and is there equitable access to those services? What types of services should be provided? Focus groups told us a lot of information about how they're used, whether it's a specific user group or the communities of color, neighborhoods. How are people using these services and these recreation amenities? And then ultimately, increasing the diversity of applicants and users for those services. So those are the goals as we start to think forward, and that's what's guiding our draft plan process as we move into that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who will step through the organizational alternatives. So Lauren, just let me know and when to move the slides forward, and we'll move from there.
Great. How do I sound? Can you all hear me?
Sound great.
All right. Okay. All right, so one of the things we've been tasked with doing is looking at the staffing within the organization and how services have been provided. Parks and Recreation is an area that Tigard has grown, over the last 10 years, adding recreation programming depth, and so that this is a really good time to take a critical look at that. And so part of that work that we are moving towards recommendations on now includes looking at the baseline assessment and some comparisons, looking at service provision needs. What do you need to have a full service program, and what are some of the ways that can be provided? So I'll step through some of those highlights. We had actually a PRAB meeting last month where we talked some preliminary findings here, and we've also had really good staff working session that have contributed to this. So we're excited to share some of this information and hear what counselors have to say. So I just want to do a little context setting and talk about first nationally some of the National Recreation and Parks Association park metrics. This is a nationwide database. You report your data, and it includes agencies nationwide. And so just to get a sense of where you are as a service provider, a lot of the things that you do are pretty much the norm for parks and recreation agencies, maintaining park sites. In a normal year, I'll put a little asterisk on things. This is a atypical year, but more than 3/4 do major jurisdiction-wide special events, which is something you've done a really great job on doing. More than 3/4 operate and manage and maintain trails and greenways. That's a key part of your park system. One thing that's slightly more unusual, but still a good percentage, administer community gardens. Next one, Alex. And when we start to look at programming that the typical parks agency provides, so themed special events, 88%, and team sports. And team sports, when you look at this across the country, team sports may mean that they're providing actual leagues, but it may also mean it's really more booking fields and things like that. So there's kind of a wide range. Social recreation events, fitness enhancement, these are all pretty typical programming. And you're newer as a recreation programming entity, with a pretty small staff, but this is probably the direction where your program will grow over the years. Next one, Alex. So another thing when you look nationally, the data gets segmented by population size. So when you look at 55,000 plus people, you really just have come outside of the size class that's 20,000 to just under 50,000 people, and you've moved into that 50,000 to 99,000 population class. And the reason both of these are up here on the screen is what you see, and which the data on the screen also shows, is as an agency serves a larger population, typically the recreation services increase. So things like programming for people with disability, as an agency gets in that 50,000 plus size class, the percentage that offer it jump up. So this just gives you some sense about demographic specific programs that agencies with your size class are starting to do, more than half of them. So after school programs, specific teen and senior programs, summer camp is a really strong area. Next one. There's also great data on staffing, and it's expressed in FTEs per 10,000 people. And so the data is also segmented into the median for all agencies, and then the lower quartile, below it 25%, and the upper quartile. And so one of the things that really jumped out to us is, even though you've added staffing, your FTEs per 10,000 is still pretty low. There's definitely more even below the lower quartile. Some of that is probably because your recreation program is still new, but it's something to keep in mind that you're definitely below the median and below kind of the norm for agencies across the country. We've also looked at some of your regional peers and looked at how they're providing services. And so just looking at the FTEs per 10,000 for Tualatin next door, it's 5.7, Westland 7.9, and Sherwood 8.9. So there's even quite a range locally, but you're still on the lower end of that. Next one, please. So when we start to look at how are other regional peers providing parks and recreation services, when we look within the metro region, there's 15 cities with more than 20,000 people. So most of those either have a parks and recreation department or they're served by a special district. So Gresham, Happy Valley, Sherwood, and Tigard are the exceptions to that. Next one, please. And so there are different ways of carrying out some of the essential functions of what's needed to be done to provide that vision that Alex shared earlier of a quality park within a 10-minute walk of anyone, and quality recreation programs that are equitably provided. And so we've been looking at tasks and functions, working with staff to make sure we're capturing everything that's specific to Tigard. And so there's land management functions, urban forestry, facility operations and maintenance, the special events, the recreation programs and services, communications and marketing, which is a key function of parks and recreation agencies, the capital improvement functions, and there's a few other smaller functions that we were also looking at that are specific to Tigard. Next one, please. And so we've been looking at different options. A Parks and Recreation department, what could that look like within Tigard? That would mean adding a new department, pulling some of the functions from Public Works into that department, probably with a Parks division and a Recreation division. And what would that mean long-term for Tigard. Another option that we're looking at are two departments. So you've got a public works department that is doing everything now with parks and recreation as part of their other functions. And so under this two department model, public works would retain the maintenance functions and you'd grow into a new department that's a recreation and community services department that really focused on the programs and the services, the communications. That's actually the way that Sherwood does it. And it works, you know, pretty well for them. They're a smaller city than you, but that's an effective local model that could work, you know, to build from where you are today. And then the other thing that we're looking at is your current structure. And how that might be refined to better support some of the park and recreation goals. So those are the three alternatives that we're exploring, and each of those, you know, has some different twists on where does capital projects live? Where does that make the most sense? You know, what do you need to do with communications function like that? So on to the next one.
And so this is our last slide, then we can jump back to questions. Just to give you a sense for next steps, as I said before, we are getting towards that part where we're actually starting to develop recommendations as we move forward. We will be using that past information to, you know, think about both, you know, new facilities and maintenance of the existing system, as well as recreation programs and services. These elements, including the existing facilities and, you know, kind of how they are today versus, and as well as with the maintenance that are proposed for each of those, start to go into that prioritized list of projects. We are looking at, you know, that 10-minute walk analysis as a way to actually start to assess and identify where specific projects might be to make sure that all community members are well served by parks and recreation facilities. And then, you know, as I said, using the City of Tigard strategic plans really as a lens to help provide the direction for those recommendations. So, you know, this is one of the first big plans to come out after that strategic plan. So how does that start to, you know, kind of cross-pollinate with what those recommendations are in the strategic plan that direction gives for specific parks? All of these pieces, you know, really start to, you know, boil down to what are the specific elements that need to happen first versus second versus third. And that's what we'll be looking at for that public survey that's coming up here fairly shortly to help the community, help us and the community prioritize what those specific projects and programs might be moving forward. So lots of things still kind of moving on this, but definitely getting into the pieces where starting to make decisions about how the draft plan comes together and what those specific elements might be. So with that, I want to thank you for your time tonight and Lauren and I'd be happy to answer any questions as best we can, and then come back to you later with more information.
Thank you, Alex and team. Council, comments or questions? Let's start with Youth Councilor Calderon.
No questions. That was a very solid presentation. Thank you guys for coming tonight.
Council President Lube.
Yeah, I have one question in regards to kind of the FTE comparison. And I know that we're so far off the mark that, you know, adding an employee here or there isn't going to make the impact that I think it would hope to, even though the two that we added, you know, I talked to Martin today and it made a huge impact. But I guess my question is, with the comparisons, do we know, because it's the parks and recreation together, and our recreation department, you know, at this current time is so small and is just really starting out and getting its legs under it, what's the comparison to recreation department size for the FTEs that we're looking at? I don't want it to be sort of apples and oranges of this really robust recreation program and using that as a comparison if we don't have that.
Right. And, you know, that's why I'm definitely emphasizing that you are newer to recreation programming and trying to get a sense of where you go. I mean, a couple things that I would say about that. Looking at some of the peers here locally, like if you look at Sherwood and you look within the Sherwood Community Services Department, which is the recreation arm, you know, it's smaller, but there's more staff than you have. The difference in Sherwood is there are more facilities that are being operated, the art center, the field house. So you don't have the facilities, which also makes it more challenging to program. The other thing is you've got some outdoor spaces that are coming that are going to need to be activated, like Universal Plaza. And so, you know, being just aware that to program those spaces, you probably will need more staffing. Typically a recreation division, though, it's not, you don't hire, you know, 8 full-time permanent people. Typically there's a real diversity of staffing. So there might be contract teachers. That's another part of what we're exploring. There might be part-time or seasonal people if you're running camps, which is something Tualatin, you know, is pretty heavy into the summer camp program. And so thinking about not just the total number of FTEs, but also the type, and just knowing if you want to grow your program, you will have to grow your staffing. Another piece about recreation is typically the communications function, which right now is pretty lean and shared across public works. There's usually a pretty hefty communications function around marketing programs, doing the website updates. If you are in a typical city, you'll see that the recreation department has usually a pretty strong social media presence and that kind of thing. And there's some staff that go along with that. So I hope that's helpful, just context.
Thank you.
Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, when I utilize our parks, I feel like that little girl, except minus the bubbles. So thank you. That was a very good presentation and a great end to the picture. You'd mentioned that Tigard administers the community gardens, and that it seemed like you thought that was unusual. Is that, I see that as kind of a community benefit or perhaps a good marketing, but is there?
Oh, I think it's not totally unusual. It's just not, you know, it's much more common in the West Coast than it is when you look nationally, that because there's a lot of value around community gardens. It's just a thing that, you know, it's something you got into early on for, I think, really good reasons. But it's just not one of these things that, oh, every agency does it. So just wanted to point that out. Shows you were ahead of the curve, I think.
Thank you.
All right, Councillor Goodhouse.
Yes, I wanted to expand on what Council President Lube asked. I had something similar, but kind of expand on that question. So in one of the examples, there was broke out with the Public Works and the Parks and Rec. So what would that chart look like as far as what the FTEs needed per 10,000? I think she was kind of hinting on that, the fact where I was kind of asking. I just want to get an idea, because if we're looking at what the 3 point whatever it is, and that's combining the two, what would we really need to be on board for the recreation, and what we would need for parks? So maybe it could skew it either way, where, you know, maybe we have way more in parks, I mean in recreation, so it's skewing the Public Works number, or vice versa. So if we were to go with that new flow chart, you know, do we have an example where everyone else is in the area under just Public Works, and where they're under recreation, and where we are too, and where we should be?
Yeah, so we're in the process of running those different scenarios. I would say across the board, regardless of which structure you go with, you know, having some additional staff resources, whether that's contract staff, whether that's staff on board, you're going to need that to deliver what you want to deliver. And so we're in the process of running some different scenarios. But Alex, if you go back to the slide 11. So we actually did a deep dive into the positions in Tualatin, Westland, and Sherwood. You know, they're kind of local peers that are, it felt like more comparable. And so they have different mixes of stuff. And, you know, you can kind of see the range and what's in recreation and what's in parks and recreation, I'm sorry, the parks maintenance function. And so there's a range. I mean, Tualatin is pretty lean. The interesting thing about Tualatin is a lot of the communications function is gathered in the city manager's office. The other thing that Tualatin does that's pretty interesting is it has centralized volunteer management and a pretty robust volunteer program. And so that's also housed in the city manager's office. And then Sherwood, the bulk of the FTEs are really in the maintenance part of things. It's a leaner recreation program, but they have those facilities and they're pretty leanly staffed, but they, you know, they still have an art center and, you know, and 1.5 people associated with that. And they have a field house and 1.5 people associated with that. And so that becomes a driver if you start adding, you know, indoor facilities. That starts requiring a facility manager. You know, we're checking in with you now as we're starting to explore, you know, how these scenarios would flesh out. And so I don't have an answer for you like, oh, this one would be, you know, this many people, this one would be that many people. I just would say overall, you probably need a lift, even if you stick with a refined version of what you're doing now, to be able to take on the parks that you've got planning in the planning works, to take on some of the new skills like fountain management after some of the plazas are in play, and also something to think about for the long term around the recreation side is, you know, the kind of equity lens of that and fee-based versus free programming and how you fund that in the future and how you staff that. That'll become a pretty critical point, because if it has to be self-supporting, you either have to have staff people assigned to get, you know, grant funding in place for people who might not be able to pay to play, or, you know, you'll have to come up with a different approach to that. So I'll just pause there because I've gone on and on for a while.
I was gonna say, yeah, 'cause our recreation program is newer, like you're saying, so it's good to know where we could take it, what we need to do that. But with our parks department and maintenance, it's been coming up for a long time as far as, you know, there's areas where we play catch up a lot, or we're not getting to areas, or, you know, what's needed so we can take care of the preventive maintenance before it becomes an issue. So that will be helpful going forward with this, to know really where we need to be so we're ahead of the curve, and we're not playing catch up and spending more money on you know, putting out fires rather than taking care of the preventive measures and taking care of and managing them properly.
Yeah, and I think that's something, you know, that came up in the parks assessment a lot, you know, talking about, you know, things that were either on deferred maintenance or, you know, that are coming up to be, you know, fixed or improved. I think the question is, you know, you have a number of great facilities. You have a number of facilities that are coming online, you know, with new development, either through the terrace or, you know, developing your undeveloped land. But I think the real question, I know Brian and Martin have talked with you about this, is how do you maintain those existing pieces at a level that is commensurate with those new places coming up, so that everybody feels like they have a great space to go to. And that's I think a question that we've been trying to address from an assessment standpoint and recommendations of. There's certainly a maintenance aspect, but then there's these other pieces for accessibility to a great piece of property 10 minutes from your house. And I think that's another question that comes into this kind of staffing and organizational strategy. What makes the most sense to be able to provide for everybody in Tigard?
Councillor Newton, you've been very patient. What questions or comments do you have?
Oh, well, I'll always take my turn. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, thank you. Very instructive. I think the comparisons to other communities are instructive, but knowing a little bit about what other communities do and how they're organized, I'm not sure that staffing per 110,000 or whatever is the best match. I think we're definitely under-resourced. I think, just basic maintenance, and also the policy we all support to have parks within a 10-minute walk, and to make sure those are equitably provided. I'm concerned about recreation being equitably provided, and so that's a concern, and I do think we're under-resourced. In terms of the organization, I would wonder how any organizational changes or structure affects the other departments in the city. Like Tualatin has volunteers in their city manager's office. Some of our local communities use, private vendors to organize and produce their community concerts. And so I'm not advocating for any specific way to move forward. I think the equity is key, and we are under-resourced. So I guess I would look at those comparisons as instruction, and really look at the best way for us to be providing the services that our community wants in an equitable manner. And again, I'll echo, I do believe we're under-resourced. But I think other communities are organized differently. They have different programs, different facilities. And so I guess I would like to look at it more with an equity and service and programming basis, and also think about how other departments are organized and function, and how that overlaps. So I guess I don't really have any questions, just more comments. Thanks.
Mr. Rager, you're not asking, this was a report out and a status update, right? You're not asking for decisions or anything further from the council tonight?
That is correct, Mr. Mayor. Thoughts are welcome. As we mentioned earlier, we're in the middle of a lot of this work, and any thoughts that you have to share with us are welcome to help us.
I guess the one comment I would make, and I think I'm probably the only one on the council that hasn't spoken yet specifically on this, but on this slide with the FTEs per population, I know we've seen this also sliced by, I think, FTEs by acre maintained probably in the past. What would be interesting to me, to some of the points that were made by other members of the council, would be really getting at park maintenance and sort of the direct cost of maintaining and managing our parks separate from recreation for these various jurisdictions. And maybe you have that and it's just not on the slide at that level of detail, but I would personally find that interesting too, to be able to, figure out what our sort of our FTE per both population and ground are, but specifically to just actual maintenance of our parks.
Sure. We've done a deeper dive than what we're sharing here tonight, but I think looking at that cost per acre for some of the comparisons, that's something we can do. One thing I did want to mention, as we looked at the baseline, one of the things we noticed, and we pointed this out to Brian and Rick. When you look into some of these national data sets like NRPA, you've got a really sophisticated internal cost accounting, and actually we make recommendations to be more deliberate about, you know, allocating costs. But when it comes to comparisons, it was skewing, you know, some of the cost data because other agencies aren't doing that. And so in the kind of nitty gritty detail, we've sliced and diced some of what you're spending to make it more comparable to some of the other organizations. And so I just wanted to put a pin in that so that if you start hearing, you know, Brian or Rick talk about that, you know, it's a good practice, but for the purposes of comparison, you don't want to skew yourself.
So the other organizations are not cost accounting accurately like that for internal costs?
No, not to that level. No, not to that level.
All right. I am, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on unless someone's got any final burning thought. All right. Thank you all, team. Very interesting and lots to think about, and I think some additional things we're hoping to see in the future. So thank you.
Yep, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for your time.
And we will move on to item number 4 on the agenda, which is to receive a Phase 2 feasibility report on the city facilities consolidation project. Director Asher and leadership team.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor, and good evening to you and to Council President Lube and the whole council. I am Kenny Asher, Community Development Director, and along with Nadine Robinson, your Central Services Director, co-lead on the City Facilities Consolidation Project, which I am really excited, delighted really, to be able to sort of kick off tonight's presentation to give you an update on that project. It's been 11 months since we were here last. We have a lot to share, and hopefully you have a lot of questions. And I think there's enough time on this agenda to get into that. That's our intent. I think Nadine is going to run the presentation tonight, as I understand.
Are you ready for me to launch that, Kenny?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Because I think the first slide is introductions. And I want to start by just kind of sharing a little bit about how we're going to do this presentation. Tonight, we really are challenged with having so much material to send, and hopefully you had a chance to read the staff report and the attachments to give you a running start. But we are going to go through these slides as efficiently as we can. I think there are about 50 of them. We've got 45 minutes slotted for the presentation. And if you could hold your questions or jot them down till we get to the end, I think we're planning on taking them all during your discussion. That's okay with you, Mr. Mayor. So if we go to the first slide.
That's fine, Kenny, but I would emphasize the point you just made. Please, all council members, write down your questions so you don't forget them.
Right, because again, there is a lot to go through, and we've worked pretty hard to try to lay it out in a way that is organized. Here's your project team. You'll recognize a number of the names in blue. This is a good portion of your leadership team at the city. And we have a whole host of consulting advisors from various architecture and economics firms and communications firms. And some of these guys you'll hear from tonight. And I'm not going to ask for any more introductions than that. People can introduce themselves, those who are presenting, before they get into their material. Yeah, we are going to do it this way. We're going to do, I'll do a quick overview of the project. We're going to then move into the state of our facilities, and there's a bit of review in those first two sections. Like I said, we were presenting to council last time in February of 2020, so it's been quite a while. We have a new council. We want to make sure everybody is basically caught up to speed on why we're doing the project. Then we're going to get into the business case, which is really the, I would say, cornerstone of our progress between last February and now. I'll give you an update on, there are two large components here: relocation of our public works operations out of downtown. That's one component, large component. The other large component is the new City Hall police station and the associated downtown redevelopment. We've got short updates to give you in both of those areas. We have a communications update for you because we have done preliminary engagement and we've drafted an engagement plan. We want to share where we are with you on that. We have updates about funding, of course, a staff recommendation, and then your discussion and hopefully action. And with regards to the action, there's no resolution, there's no motion necessary. We're just looking for direction from council, whether you would like for us to keep going or not. And I'll explain how we're thinking about that as we get into this. Next slide. Okay, the overview of the project. Why are we doing this city facilities consolidation project? Most urgently, I think we want you and the community to understand that we're trying to address existing and projected failures of the city's downtown facilities. And there are four failures to us. One is the rising costs to maintain and repair these aged structures. Costs that we are nowhere near keeping up with. It's a budget issue, a fiscal issue for the city. We have seismic risks. These are risks to both our employees in the case of some of these buildings who occupy them, and also a risk in our ability to respond to a seismic event, our emergency preparedness. We're trying to address that with this project. Third, we have space limitations, in some cases severe, like with the case in the case of our police department. And associated with those space limitations are the rising costs and limited options in addressing them by leasing space. If we're not going to grow our own space or make our own new space, we're going to have to lease it. That's a questionable prospect. And finally, there is a problem with the overall fiscal prudence of our continuing along the path that we are on, unless we make a change. In other words, what is the most fiscally prudent thing to do given all available options? And so all of that is, I would say, the key to what we're trying to do here, but we're also at the same trying to recognize and correct the city's role in downtown's emergence as a center for living, working, and playing. You can see in the graphic here, everything that's outlined in green is property that we own. The little bit in yellow we lease. We are the largest landowner in the downtown, and yet we are not using our land in a way that furthers our strategic plan or any of our downtown plans. You could say that we are land rich, but we're not putting this very valuable asset to the best possible use. So we're trying to address that as well. Next slide. What is the project? Okay, in 4 points, we're trying to relocate the public works operations outside of our downtown core. I think you all know how we lay out at Burnham and Hall, but everything you see in mauve there is the public works site. Everything you see in blue, we'll just call the City Hall police station site. So we're trying to move the stuff in mauve out of the downtown. Then we would like to construct a new City Hall and police station and a shared use parking garage on that existing public works site, on the mauve site. That means moving the stuff off the blue into the mauve. That would allow us to redevelop all that stuff in blue for market rate and affordable housing, and hopefully to relocate and improve the Jim Griffiths Memorial Skate Park as part of this project. That's the description. Next slide. Really quickly, I want to hit the benefits of this project because everything I've talked about so far were kind of negatives. Things we're trying to stop from happening, failures we're trying to avoid. But there are tremendous benefits with this approach. I'm going to state them really quickly, and then we can talk about them more in the discussion. First of all, we need to move our facilities into the 21st century. And what are the issues that we as a city are facing in the 21st century? Again, we want to be prepared for a seismic event. We want to be climate responsible. We want to be able to respond in a way that our growing community needs. Part of that means better safety, security, training, and operations space for our Tigard Police Department. I'm not going to elaborate on all the issues there because I think you know what they are. I think the community is understanding how deficient our police space is on its own. There are benefits in this project that are in the project itself if it gets built, like a new community room, a new and improved skate park, and new parking supply for downtown visitors. Next slide. I mentioned the housing. I want to point out that we're targeting 30% affordable. That would mean 150 households to be able to attain affordable housing in our downtown. And speaking of housing in the downtown, that's what we need. If we want a walkable downtown, especially in this Burnham corridor, which is starting to really change, if we want more shopping and dining and nightlife in downtown, we need more housing, and we can build more housing on our land. And finally, you'll hear about this more later. This is a proposal that comes with revenue back to the city to the tune of $13 million in new revenues from land sale proceeds and tax streams. Okay, next slide. Where are we? So we've just completed what we call phase 2 of feasibility. So phase 1 was done prior to February of 2020. And when we came to council 11 months ago, we were saying that we think it's feasible to stop separate facility planning, along different tracks. Not to have the police planning for their own facility and public works planning for its own facility and court trying to figure out its own parking. We said, we think it's feasible to plan together, and the council approved and ordered us to move into phase 2, which we've now completed. And what we were studying in phase 2, and which we're going to report on tonight, is whether it's feasible to proceed now or whether this is a concept that is nice but should wait. You're going to hear our recommendation about proceeding tonight. And that would lead us into phase 3, which is really going to take up, we look at more than one thing in these phases, but the most important thing in this third and final phase is, will the community support this idea? Even if it is a smart project for us, the government, to advocate for, the real question is, can it become a community supported project? And that's something that won't be determined until the summer into the fall of this year, if you determine that we should keep going tonight. Next slide. So what you told us back in February, 3 things. This is what the direction we took from council. 1, to stop pursuing redevelopment concepts to reuse downtown properties for single uses. 2, to commission a functional and conceptual design phase for a new city hall and police station, which you'll hear about tonight. And 3rd, to accelerate our timeline to secure this non-downtown site for public works operations. You'll hear about that tonight as well, because that's what you told us to work on 11 months ago. Next phase. So next slide. What have we been doing since you gave us that direction? Well, in the spring and summer, we began studying sites for public works outside the downtown. We started the business case analysis. We selected design firms and communication firms. And then in the fall and winter, we put those firms to work on initial design studies. We finished off some communications research, planning, and outreach. We narrowed the public works possible sites, and we finalized the business case, which we're excited to present to you tonight. Okay, next slide. I'm gonna come back to this at the very end of our presentation, but just so everybody is clear, we are recommending that you direct us to begin this 3rd feasibility phase. And I won't read those bullets here, I'll read them at the end. There are things that we feel like we must do over the next 6 to 9 months in order to make this project real. We're also recommending that council direct us to prepare a formal budget request of $150,000 to complete the work of this phase, because we need that budget in order to get the answers to the questions before us. So in closing, I would just like to share that we think this project is feasible. We think that it's better to plan for all of the departments together and all of the facilities together. We think it's smart to move now. And as you will hear later, we think that the community will support this project. We'd like an opportunity to go out and talk to them extensively. So thank you, Nadine. and for advancing those slides. And we're into your section.
Okay, thanks, Kenny. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Nadine Robinson, the City Central Services Director. Tonight, I'm going to provide a brief update on the current state of city facilities. This will be a review for some of you, but it could be helpful for community members that are new to the project. Since the 1980s, when the City Hall complex and the Public Works building were constructed, Tigard's population has more than doubled. To keep up with that growth, many updates and modifications have been done to the buildings. However, even with the changes, the buildings are at capacity, systems are struggling to keep up, and expensive repairs and system replacements are estimated to cost up to $13.9 million. So tonight you'll hear about 3 different areas, and Kenny touched on those briefly, but the 3 are aging facilities, seismic code concerns, and inadequate space. As with all buildings, as they age, maintenance is needed and expensive system repairs and replacements become necessary. I'll provide examples of a few of those as we go along through the presentation. And then secondly, while buildings met seismic code when they were built, the codes have been updated and the buildings no longer meet those codes. So cost to upgrade facilities to current code could be as high as $19.2 million. And then lastly, space is inadequate for the current number of employees. And this isn't really surprising when you realize there's been a 250% growth in staffing since the 1980s. Oops. So what this diagram shows you is that facility staff are currently working on looking at 107% increase in work orders and requests over the last 5 years. While the buildings are meeting, excuse me, sorry. So the need for the maintenance and system replacements is documented in the 2016 facilities assessment. And as you can see on the slide, we ranged from the good to the poor category, and those continue to decrease if we aren't able to keep up with our maintenance and system repairs. So let's start with the police department. The department is extremely overcrowded. It can't support its current operations, and their staff are spread out through 3 different buildings. That results in inefficiencies in operations. Insufficient on-site storage has resulted in additional rental expenses and again reduced to, oops, sorry, get my buttons going crazy here. So insufficient storage has resulted in rental expenses, again, reduced efficiency when staff needs to access off-site materials. A locker room space, especially for female officers, is critical. And those who've had the opportunity to tour the police department, you may have noticed that they have rooms that need to serve for multiple purposes. For example, breakout rooms being used for briefings and trainings, the sally ports used for intake, gun cleaning, and as a workout facility. Again, we've got extensive system repairs that are needed in the police department, such as the roof, which many people have already heard about, and also the HVAC system. Additionally, staff have identified sewer lines that are corroding and needed replacement, and the current facility doesn't have adequate security, which could put staff and the facility at risk. Finally, the police department doesn't meet seismic survivability requirements for an essential facility, which could result in impact the city's ability to maintain operations and respond in an emergency. So the City Hall has gone through a recent remodel, and that was to accommodate the photo enforcement program. However, the permit center is still in need of updating. Additional system repairs that are needed for the buildings include replacement of deteriorating main sewer line that goes into the City Hall, replacement of the original HVAC systems to accommodate the increased staffing, and replacement of the City Hall roof. Additionally, in a seismic event, the buildings can be expected to sustain moderate damage. So again, inhibiting our ability to provide service to our residents. Our public works space is inadequate for its 86 employees. Staff work from multiple locations. Crew spaces are undersized. And as seen in this photograph, we have staff working out of our fleet bays. We're leasing space, and that right now is costing approximately $76,000 per year. That includes costs for office space as well as operational materials storage. The building also doesn't meet current seismic codes, and that's especially concerning since our emergency operation center is there. The cost to bring that building up to code would be over $10 million, and again, really inhibits our ability to help our citizens in the event of a seismic event. So our niche is our technology center, and it's home to 16 employees. Over the years, the city's made a number of modifications to the building to make it workplace for a growing number of employees. To continue to allow for that growth, we're actually converting the garage storage area this summer to make some office space for them. But in addition to that, we have things like replacement of building siding, HVAC updates that need to be done. We need to do some ADA work in there to bring it into compliance. So in summary, maintenance, system repairs, and updates to city facilities continue to cost Tigard residents. And the question really is, do we put that money into repairing what we have, replacing those systems, or do we put that into new buildings? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jerry Johnson from Johnson Economics.
Thanks, Nadine. My name's Jerry Johnson with Johnson Economics. We worked on the business case, and we get to the first slide, Nadine. The basic concept in the business case was to take a look at two scenarios. The first scenario would be to stay in your existing facilities, complete the upgrades that are necessary, both to bring the buildings up to standard, as well as repair and maintenance on an ongoing basis, and to lease additional space to make it sort of an apples and apples comparison, so you have adequate space for your facilities. This was done over a 20-year horizon. The second scenario was construction of the consolidated facilities, sale of the excess property for development, bring that excess property back onto the tax rolls when development was assumed to be completed, and moving the Public Works Department. The challenge again was apples to apples. One of the things we did is we tried to normalize between the same level of space and bringing your buildings up to standards in the current facilities scenario. What we really couldn't get to is the quality and quantity of the space was not the same. We can get the quantity the same by leasing additional space. We really can't get the quality the same. Regardless of how much money you put into that, it's going to be difficult to get it to be as efficient as a purpose-built space specifically for the city. There's also a significant difference in the effective life of the facilities, which is an important aspect of this. At the end of the 20-year period that we looked at this, there's a lot of life left assumed in a new facility, whereas in the existing facilities with the upgrades, they're still likely near the end of their effective life at that point in time, because they would have been, well, they're 1980, so 20, 40, 60 years old, probably about their effective life. So you go to the next slide, please, Nadine. A summary of the findings in this, and we can get back to whatever details you want in the questions. Scenario one had an estimated overall cost of $180.7 million. We sort of lost our slide here. Of that, $33.1 million is capital expenditures to bring the building up to standards again, which includes ADA and seismic rehab. We have repairs and maintenance based on your last 5 years, which are significantly higher than they would be in the other scenario, primarily because most of the systems are older and requiring a higher level of maintenance and repair. We also have additional rental of expenses over 20 years of almost a little over $74 million for $180.7 million total is a total cost to the city over that horizon. Under the new facilities, scenario two, we had capital expenditures estimated at $152 million for construction. Repair and maintenance is significantly lower as new facilities, estimated at $33.1 million. The debt service to cover this is expected to come in at about $67.5 million over 20 years for interest costs. So a total cost of 252.7, so higher than the cost of remaining in existing facilities. What we did then is we also incorporated the value of the facilities at the end of the period, since you still have effective life left of this new facility, considerable life. That was estimated at $91.3 million, which is escalated, but roughly half the value of building a new facility. And we had total additional revenues of $13.4 million, which Kenny talked on a little bit. That's basically sale of the land after you move the city hall to eventual residential development. And the assumption was property taxes from a residential development that was going to provide a level of abatement to meet affordable housing criteria or goals and objectives. So we get property taxes from that as well as sales revenues from that. So if we incorporate that 91.3 and the $13.4 million, the overall net cost to the city is $148 million, which is roughly $32.7 million below the estimated cost to remain in place and keep those facilities upgraded. And again, most of the difficult to measure factors like quality of space would favor the new facilities as well. So while it looks like on a business case, you can make an argument straight up on a dollar value basis that it's more effective to build the new facilities, that case would actually be stronger when you put in sort of the intangibles, which includes both better quality of space, cohesive facilities, and actually better urban utilization of your properties in the downtown area. So that was the conclusion of our piece, is probably a lower cost option over that horizon to build the new facilities. Everyone who's got aging facilities deals with the same point or the same issue, which is at one point do we reach where it doesn't make any sense to keep pouring money into the old facilities, try to keep them alive a little bit longer. At a certain point, eventually all reach functional obsolescence, and it's sort of the correct business move to make a move and to do something different. And that's what I have. So I think it's what the public works relocation effort is the next slide, I think, Nadine.
Is this the slide or the next one, Jerry?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I had one more. So summary. Okay. So cost less than remaining in place. That's a fairly simple piece. The number one measure you looked at, it's a significantly better amount of space. We've got better urban design solutions. You do get property tax revenues from the released sites. We included the 20-year thing, but beyond 20 years, you'll continue to get those property tax revenues. And we think it's actually going to catalyze additional development along the Burnham corridor and your broader central city area. So, right, forgot I had a third slide, Nadine, sorry.
Good evening, Council. I'm Brian Reger, your Public Works Director. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. As you know, we have been working with Capacity Commercial Group since April of 2020 and looking for a new site for us. We provided to them some parameters that we were looking for. We need about 8 acres. We'd like that to be flat for public works development. We would like it to be in Tigard, and we also told them it was okay to piece together multiple parcels to get that 8 acres. Scott Edwards and Associates Architects helped us analyze that list of sites that we were given, and we are currently down to 2, and we've talked to you a little about those. I will be coming back probably inside of 2 weeks. We will make a decision as to which of those sites will work. The success for the CFC project really depends on Public Works finding a site, and we need to be acquiring that site ideally this summer. Next slide, please. Our goal is a modern day Public Works facility, and what drives the size of the site is not an office building, but it's more the types of things that we have to store. We have outdoor equipment that has to maneuver around, and we have to store that equipment. We have material storage that takes up space. and a few of other key components you see there, including a fleet maintenance facility and outdoor storage. Next, I'd like to introduce Brandon Dole with Scott Edwards and Associates, and he will talk a little bit about space programming for Public Works. And you can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. It's good to see everyone again. Again, my name is Brandon Dole, project manager for Scott Edwards Architecture. With me tonight on the line is Sid Scott, principal in charge for the project. As Brian mentioned, we've been working with the Public Works Department for about the last 6 months. And to summarize that effort, the goal is to identify a future home for Public Works. For the essence of time tonight, I want to describe that work in 4 categories. And we kicked off the project with programming, so that would be category 1. We started with developing a space program for not only the buildings that Public Works would need, but also for the operations yard. Space provisions for the buildings included current staffed positions that could be filled today, and then growth projections for the department over the next 15 to 20 years. So the key takeaway is the buildings you see in the square footages we provided include growth projections for the city's department. Provisions for the operations yard include parking for fleet vehicles, large equipment, bulk material storage, and other site amenities that are typical of these facilities. That programming effort then went into developing what you see here is the ideal operations complex for Tigard Public Works. Obviously, this was based on the prior programming efforts and specific to Tigard. Now, you've all heard that term, that the ideal 8-acre site, and what you see here is that ideal 8-acre site. If we could carve out our own parcel in the service center of the city, this is what we would carve out. You could see we're 3 main structures: an office building, a fleet maintenance facility, and a warehouse storage building. The site lays out parking for staff and visitors, but then also for the entire Public Works fleet. A few site amenities such as a fuel island, decant facilities, truck wash are all included in this 8-acre ideal site. Now, obviously, we can't carve out our own site in the center of the city. So why do we do this? Well, we need a basis beyond the program to then evaluate the other candidates. So as Brian mentioned, we were handed 13 candidates by Capacity Commercial. With Brian and his team, we narrowed that down to 5 best candidates and dove in with an analysis. So that would be our 3rd level of work or effort. We vetted those 5 candidates against this ideal program and the ideal operations yard. We vetted challenges and constraints with each of those sites, and a lot of those challenges stem from environmental overlays dealing with things such as wetlands and floodplains. That analysis work then, the goal is to summarize all of this work into a final master plan document. That master plan document would then be a guide for the department to pursue the development. We're currently looking at the end of this month for the first draft of that document, and then recommendations on how to proceed on one of the 2 sites. With that, I'll turn it back over to Brian.
Thank you, Brandon. You can go to the next slide, Nadine. The existing Public Works site is a water asset. It used to be the headquarters of the old Tigard Water District, so it is entirely a water asset, and currently non-water uses of Public Works are paying rent to the water fund. So for the CFC project to utilize the site for non-water purposes, the water fund would need to be reimbursed for that. So step 1 of that process was getting an appraisal done. We've done that, and as you see on the slide, the appraised value is around $4.75 million, and that's being accounted for in the financial plan that you'll hear about later. So to summarize, for the CFC project to be successful, Public Works must find and acquire a new site this summer. We will soon be coming to you with a final decision on a site and a recommended acquisition method. At this time, I'll hand things over to DLR Architects, who will say more about the CFC project.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Kent Larson with DLR Group Architects and Engineers. We have been engaged by the city to focus in on the consolidation site for the police station and city hall functions. We were handed some things to focus on, including how to make this an efficient project and work with the stakeholders of the police and city departments to find efficiencies in the consolidation, as well as considering equity and parity for the city employees that would use the building. We also were tasked with looking into the details of what we know today about working from home and other modes of working, and looking into the future about how that should affect the size and nature of the facility. And we have worked closely with the city on that. A lot of work really, especially by your team, to really evaluate and think through what is appropriate for the future so that we build the right amount of space if we do this project. Also, we were asked to sort of find the highest and best use for this property in looking ahead at your strategic plan. What would be a good companion for the consolidated facility on this site, including housing or the skate park? And so we did take a look at that, and we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. As we look at the project, it's important to step back and make sure we have the vision and goals for the city of Tigard in front of us, especially your strategic plan, pedestrian connections, making high value use of this site, making sure that it's safe, equitable, and feels like a place that the citizens of Tigard will want to visit and use as part of your downtown core. Next slide, please. So our work to date has brought us to this conceptual recommendation. The key features of the project would be a consolidated police and city services building. We think that would best be configured as a 4-story building with a basement that would house the secure parking for the police. As one structure. A second structure would be a parking garage with about 244 spaces and 3 levels. Next slide, please. The site components that we would recommend would also include some surface parking. There's a portion of the site, sort of the panhandle to the north and the west, that probably is best configured as surface parking. And we also are recommending that the site be configured so that there are 3 ways in and out. This is especially important for the police function on the site, so that there's options to come and go, especially if one of the entries is compromised in an emergency. And lastly, looking at the site and what will fit, while it would have been nice to consider housing on this site along with the skate park, we really think they both will not fit, and the best companion we feel for the site is the skate park, located on the corner of Burnham and Hall. There would be a nice place to showcase a relocated and improved skate park. Next slide, please. We've taken a look at as you see in this diagram, for how this 4-story building would be configured, and have some initial concepts about which programs would go where. And you can see that the building would be it's about half police functions and a half city services functions. And those details would be worked out as we proceed. Looking ahead, we're going to be working with your communications team to get some community input. You're going to hear about that in a moment. And looking ahead at the next few months, we're recommending that we do some more detailed investigations for site, including civil and survey investigations, geotechnical investigations, and a little more detailed look at the cost estimate for this particular project. And then we'll take the feedback from the community to give some input and create some imagery to express the values that we are being given by your community members. Next slide, please. So in summary, I guess what I would say is this proposed project is a direct translation of your strategic vision for the downtown, and would pretty much come out just like this diagram that was prepared a few months ago, with the density and pedestrian connectivity that is envisioned for your city, and freeing up the current site for the housing development that's been discussed. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, Council. I'm Kirsten Hauge with Kearns and West, and we were brought on board to help the city with communications and engagement, as well as PAC West communications. So tonight I'll share more about our process, what we've heard during early engagement, and upcoming involvement opportunities. So to start with a little bit about our approach, we began with a research phase to inform our messaging and communication strategies by reviewing background information from the city and gathering insights through informal interviews and discussions with both internal and external stakeholders. So these meetings included the following: a series of 4 small group discussions with city staff, interviews with 9 Tiger community leaders, and a 2-hour discussion group with 6 downtown stakeholders. And then based upon what we heard, we developed a communications and engagement plan and tools for early engagement, which I'll talk about next. Next slide, please. Great. So as you can see here, these are some of the groups that we've been talking with over the past few months to begin to raise awareness about the project, really test how we're talking about it, and gather input about future engagement approaches. So you can see these include a range of downtown community and business interests, your existing Tigard citizen committees, including 2 that are upcoming, and conversations with key community stakeholders that represent a range of interests, anyone from elected officials to long-term residents, parents, and Dreamland skate parks. Next slide, please. So what did we hear in this engagement? Overall, we heard from residents an interest in hearing about the tangible benefits of this project. What's in it for them? And from that, a lot of support for opportunities downtown, including affordable housing. That seemed to really resonate. Additionally, the smart investment and opportunity to reduce costs for this project, the safety elements related to the seismic upgrades also really made sense to people when they heard about the reasons for the project. Not surprisingly, given the state of the country with the COVID pandemic, there's also a lot of cost sensitivity and what this means for them in terms of their pocketbook. So they want to know their tax dollars are used effectively and efficiently. Many were also surprised to hear about the aging facilities and the condition of the current buildings. And once they learned a little bit more about the reasons for the project, there was general support with the folks that we met with for the project concept. And really most of their questions and what they wanted to know about focused more on the details of the implementation and tying into even how COVID-19 factors into planning, what it means with more folks working from home, how that space planning works with offices. And then finally, another common theme was just the importance of the mayor and council as ambassadors in reaching the community. They trust what they hear, and you're another avenue to help get the word out about this project and the opportunities to be engaged. Next slide, please. So based upon what we heard from this early engagement, here's a few guiding principles that we're applying moving forward to approach. So in terms of what we're saying, given what we learned that the aging facilities are really not generally aware of within the community, really focusing first on the project need, that the facilities are aging, overcrowded, and need very expensive repairs. Tigard residents are also really practical, and they want to know the details of why this makes sense and why it's cost effective. So be as specific as possible. For example, sharing that the savings to Tigard, as you've heard today, over 20 years is about $33 million. Appealing to community interests and needs. Many expressed interest in having a community room in City Hall that would be available to rent for civic events. So kind of tying that into how this project both benefits the city and the community. And then finally connecting the project to the city's overall vision for Tigard. So moving forward, how we're engaging is looking at meeting people where they are, which does look different today during COVID. So that means more virtual briefings and events at existing planned meetings within community groups. and working through community leaders like you, as well as our Tigard committee leads, and encouraging them to spread the word, inviting input on community values and priorities and showing what we heard, and most importantly, how it was addressed. So demonstrating the benefit of them taking the time to tell us what they think. Focusing on equitable outreach, which is a priority for the city. So not only reaching those groups who traditionally engage in projects, but looking at ways to reach those who have been historically underserved, using tools and existing networks within the city, such as the Community Roundtable, to reach community-based organizations, nonprofits, and even churches to reach those most in need in the community. And then leveraging city communications channels to spread the word and encourage feedback. We heard good feedback about the use of those. And then finally creating an educational video to help tell the story about this project and its benefits. Next slide. So what this means, following council direction tonight, will open up the door to broad community engagement. And to get the word out and hear from them, we'll be asking again for their input about Tigard values and priorities to inform the preliminary design, as you heard today from DLR, and getting the word out in multiple ways, as some of them are listed here. So we really look forward to hearing what residents think, and we'll also be reporting out what we hear in monthly summaries and in a final report to council later this spring. So ultimately, we know community voices are key to shape the right solution to Tigard, and we're committed to a transparent and ongoing conversation as we move forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Toby LaFrance, who will share more about the project funding for this project.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Toby LaFrance, Finance and Information Services Director. So when we were presenting this project last February, we presented a set of funding principles and showed that the project is feasible. Since then, you've been hearing about how we've sharpened our pencils. We've updated areas such as our space needs, costs, and introduced a business case. After these updates, I'm happy to say that this project, with all of its benefits to the community that you've been hearing about this evening, is still feasible and the principles are intact. The principles that we've been discussing are on the slide that's in front of you this evening. We'll be talking a little bit more about a voter-approved GO bond. With this bond, if the community voted yes for this bond, a yes vote would have the effect of not raising tax rates. Our utilities and our special revenue funds will pay for their proportionate share of space, and this is something we'll be discussing later this evening. In addition, a couple other key components are that the sale of the city's land helps to offset the cost of the projects. Photo enforcement revenues above program costs will be used to pay for a portion of the police facility needs, and urban renewal will assist with public improvements and parking. Next slide, please. On the subject of project costing, we continue to include all project cost categories. This includes land, hard costs like construction, soft costs like planning, contingency, and financing costs. As mentioned, these costs have been updated, and I'd like to highlight two important factors in costs and actions that we can take to reduce costs to the community. First is the amount of space that's needed within our buildings. After getting updated space needs from our architects, we factored in what COVID response has taught us about providing community services during COVID, namely, that some services and jobs can be done at least in part from remote locations, and that this can reduce our space needs. As Kent Larson mentioned, we worked to look at the long-term impact that this change and work model could provide. Staff did a job-by-job inventory, looking at the likelihood of flexible work locations for these jobs. The end result of this analysis is that it saved about 10,000 square feet in our building and reduced project costs by over $12 million. And this is the model that we're working with and moving forward with. The second important factor I'd like to highlight is the cost of time. You've heard a couple of times about people saying that time is costly on this project. We've been told by our consultants that construction costs grow by, on average, 7% annually. As mentioned, one of the costs that we're dealing with is contingency, And as we're early in the process, we want to maintain the contingency at this early stage so that we can have it for important stages like construction and other later phases. Costs are based on Public Works being in its needed facility and out of the current building, and construction on a new police facility, City Hall, in downtown by the summer of 2023. There is little wiggle room in our feasibility without hitting the contingency and while maintaining our funding principles. We can delay maybe 9 or 12 months without impacting those two factors. Further, in doing a further sensitivity analysis on the cost of time to our project, we could delay beyond that 9 to 12 months by about 2.5 years by spending that contingency and not having it available for later stages. Beyond that time frame, the contingency is gone and adjustments would be needed to the scope and or funding principles. In short, time is important, and delay at any stage in this project is costly for the project as a whole. Next slide, please. So talking about the sources, the very centerpiece of the sources for this project is a voter-approved GeoBond. Based upon direction from Council last February, the city has restructured its existing GEO debt on parks and the library to shorten the payoff period. It also had the positive impact of reducing interest costs to the tune of $1.25 million in savings to our community. And we're doing that by utilizing the current property tax rate of approximately 33.85 cents per thousand of assessed value in the city of Tigard. Council will be asked to move the GEO bond forward in July for a November vote, and the bond will be structured to maintain the existing tax rate so that we can afford this community project, and a yes vote would have the effect of not raising tax rates. Further, our utilities will need to pay their proportionate share for the space. As the business case shows, building this project is the long-term, lower-cost scenario, saving this community roughly $33 million over the next 20 years. Taking that savings and that concept and applying it to our utility rates, this means that building the project will keep the rates that show up on a utility bill lower over the next 20 years. Like the Lake Oswego Tigard project, there is an upfront cost that upfront costs are needed to see the long-term savings. To pay for the project, utility rates will need to be adjusted, and we will use the next 6 months to refine the amount and timing for those increases. Initial estimates show that the typical home's bill will increase by $5 to $8 per month across the 4 services of water, sewer, storms, and park combined. Water, sewer, and stormwater rates pay for currently steady ongoing operations and variable capital costs, and those 3 areas appear to have some capacity to pay for their fair share of the facility within their existing rates. The Parks and Recreation fee is the exception, in that it pays for only a portion of the operations of Parks and Recreation and is not calculated to pay for variable capital costs. This results in having no capacity to pay for their share of the facility within existing rates, and the Park and Recreation fee makes up the largest portion of the $5 to $8 estimate. Further looking at Parks and Recreations, the other funding source for that service is our general fund. To create capacity to pay for park share without impacting the Park and Recreation fee, Tigard would need to either make some significant service level cuts in the general fund or change our funding principles by sizing the GEO bond to pay for the park share, resulting in an increase in property tax rates to pay for the bond. In short, maintaining our funding principles means an increase in some utility rates in the next couple of years in order to save those same utilities money and have lower rates in the long run. Next slide, please. To continue moving this project forward for council action this summer, staff will further refine our project costs and funding allocations so that we can appropriately size the GEO bond for the community to consider. We will further refine the funding allocation to utilities and the estimate that it would have on utility rates. And lastly, we'll be requesting a budget amendment to the budget this spring in the third quarter supplemental in order to complete phase 3 work. In conclusion, we can do this. It is the least cost alternative. It brings multiple benefits to the community. Our funding principles remain in place, and this project is still feasible. And I believe Kenny is going to finish up our presentation this evening.
Thank you, Toby. Mr. Mayor and Council, we are here to have you affirm all of the work that you've just heard about that we've conducted over the past year in phase 2, and to ask that you direct us to commence a third feasibility phase, which will allow us to do a few critically important things. We need to execute steps up to, but not including, closing on a property acquisition for the Public Works Operations Relocation component. That same project needs to assemble a project management team and an architecture and engineering team. On the City Hall Police Station site, we need to undertake engineering and other studies on the existing Public Works site downtown to prepare for the reuse of that site for a new City Hall and police station, which includes getting an adequate cost estimate so that when we come back to you, we will know exactly how that GeoBond that Director LaFrance just talked about needs to be sized. Similarly, as you heard from Toby just now, we need to execute aspects of our financial plan, including sharpening the pencil and the timing on the utilities. And finally, we need to implement our communications plan to hear from the community. And again, to do all of the above work, we would like you to direct us to prepare a formal budget request of $150,000. I hope that you have learned a few things in this presentation. I am so impressed with my colleagues on this project and the quality of advisors that we have on the project. It has been a really incredible effort and a bunch of great problem solvers to work with. It's really been a joy. The problem is we've been missing 5 of our teammates because we cannot do this without you, the council. And so with that, I'd like to conclude our presentation and to turn this over to you, Mr. Mayor, and your council to see if we can get questions answered and some direction. Thank you for your patience through the presentation.
So Kenny, thank you. And I want to thank the entire team. And I do not say this lightly. This is the most clear, organized, and thorough presentation that I've ever seen at our city council in my 9 years of elected office now. So I want to thank you all for that, truly. I actually don't have a single question. I have a comment, but I'll hold that for later and we'll go allow other members of the council. But I think the whole team should be really proud of the quality of this work. So let's start with Councilor Newton.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, I'll limit it to questions this go around. It occurs to me, and maybe you've looked at this, as we all know, the Jim Griffith Skate Park is a memorial skate park. And I just hope we're looking at any commitments we made to that family and the community about that project. So just kind of put that out there. I don't know that there were any, and maybe you've all thought of that, but I would just ask that be checked into. Also, wondering if, as part of moving forward, when we thought we were going to have a light rail station across Hall, we did a lot of work about how that property across Hall was going to connect to our downtown. And I'm wondering if at some point soon, as I've requested of staff a couple of, I think it was a month or so ago, if we could have a brief presentation on what that looks like now. So that's another question. I'm a little confused, and maybe you can go over it after the rest of the council ask their questions. What we're asking the community, I heard community values, priorities, and messages about the facility. I also thought this slide on key themes was great, but I'm wondering if we need to get the community to buy into, what we're faced with to start with. The issue that I'm concerned about, which is our aging facilities and the cost. And then the last question I have is, are we going to poll the community at all about our financing plan? My history with Tigard is people like to know what they're paying for. And I wonder if there's consideration for us just going out for a straight, even though it would be maybe a little bit higher rate, just a straight bond for the facility. So that's another question I have. Maybe you've thought about that, maybe you've moved on. So sorry to blast at you like a fire hose, but those are my questions. Thank you.
Would you like for us to take those now? We can.
Yeah, Kenny, I think it'd be best to take them counselor by counselor.
Okay, I think I can take the first, and I might need you to repeat the one about the planning for the station area. With regards to the Jim Griffiths Memorial Skate Park, I appreciate the point you're making, Councilor Newton. We have not gone back and reviewed minutes, and at least I haven't, and I don't know that our park supervisors or Director Rager has either, to ensure that any commitments that we made then are being kept. We will certainly do that, and we're still talking about a potential relocation of the skate park. There is a scenario where it just stays in place. However, we don't think that that would maximize this overall project. That skate park probably wants to be with the civic uses and not with all of the new housing. And that's probably what our developers are going to tell us when we go to sell the City Hall property. But what I do want to emphasize is that we have had a couple of really positive, constructive, generative discussions with Dreamland Skate Parks. And we're fortunate because that's the same firm that built that park, that fundraised for it. You probably know, I don't need to tell you, they have Tigard roots. I believe they're on the call tonight, and they are really excited about trying to get an even better skate park built for all of the people who use it. And it really is a City of Tigard landmark. So we'll make sure to be thorough in the diligence that we do there, but we're off to a really good start in thinking about how that park can be improved as part of this project. I think Kirsten can probably take the question about whether we're going to do another poll on the funding. That's something that we haven't gotten into yet, and how we're going to be engaging with the community. But Councilor Newton, will you repeat the part of the question with regards to station area planning?
Sure. You know, the Southwest Corridor project isn't coming anytime soon, and we had done some planning, you know, to plan for that. So I'm wondering what that looks like now. And, you know, I know we're still doing work in the Tigard Triangle, so a lot of the associated uses hasn't gone away, but now I sort of have unanswered questions in my mind about what that looks like, since the light rail isn't coming anytime soon.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Most of that planning was east of Hall Boulevard. West of Hall Boulevard, where we're doing this project, two things. One, we have a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing that we didn't want displaced either by the Southwest Corridor project or the associated development or this project. And I'm talking about apartments that are on Hall Boulevard, and you know where they are. They're a little bit north of us here. So I don't think that anything really changes for us in the absence of Southwest Corridor. You might recall that this concept, I know the mayor recalls, this concept grew up, even though it has only recently become public. It was a glimmer in our eyes at the start of the Southwest Corridor planning process, so much so that we asked TriMet to partner with us. And I say that to say this project has been on the boards all along the Southwest Corridor project. We always expected, with or without a light rail station, we would be trying to redevelop the city-owned properties.
Right.
So
Kenny, I would even add that, you know, if you look at our concept that we were pushing TriMet for, it's really basically this concept minus the station over the top of it.
That's right. And unfortunately, we have more room without that station. So Councilor Newton, I guess to summarize, I'd like to continue this discussion because it's come up a few times. And I know you took a real interest in the Hall Boulevard station area plan. So we should come back to this, and we can. But the short answer is, I don't think that the absence of the station or the the stoppage of that program, of that light rail program, changes our plans at all.
No, I guess what I was asking is what happens on the east side now? That's my question. So you're saying the plans stay the same for the east side, other than the light rail? That's what I'm asking.
I don't know if anything happens on the east side.
Okay, that's my question.
I don't know that anything happens. Kirsten, maybe you can take a shot at answering the counselor's question about precisely what it is we're going to be asking the community and whether we have any polling planned.
Sure. So I'm glad you asked for a clarification about that, Counselor. As you saw from what we heard, there is a lack of awareness about the aging facilities. And so certainly what we want to hear from the community as we move forward into the next few months of outreach is just generally, what do they think about this proposed solution for Tigard? And does it make sense to them after hearing the rationale for why or why not? The more specific outreach that DLR and myself was talking about for February is getting that input on community values and priorities to inform kind of the preliminary visioning and conceptual plans for the new City Hall building as well. So there will be some focused engagement on that. And then in terms of polling for the financing plan, I think that's a question to be further discussed with Kenny and others within the project team, as well as with PAC West Communications, to see if that's a component that could be added in at some point over the next few months after we have our education and engagement period.
I would just wrap that up by saying we're totally open to it, and that's why we want to get into phase 3, because we're not entirely sure where we're going to need more information, and it may absolutely be about the financial plan. And if a poll makes sense, then we would do it.
I will just make the comment that if that is going to proceed, I want to make sure that PAC West is in the center of that discussion and making sure that the polling is more, I'm going to just say this, more useful than I think we felt like our public safety levy polling was. Let's put it that way.
And Paul and Chris are on this call tonight, so they heard you say that, and we'll make sure of it.
All right, Councillor Newton, did you have anything further on
No more questions. No more questions. Thanks.
Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, Mayor. I too thought it was a very thorough report, very organized. Thank you so much. It answered so many of the questions, couple of which Councillor Newton asked, so I don't have to ask about the financial aspect in the polling, the East Side Station. One aspect I was thinking of, if this project were to move forward, it obviously would bring lots of jobs to the community and dollars that would stay within the community. Has that been examined, or is that in a future feasibility study?
It's not been studied, and it's not actually scoped either. Again, if that's something that the council would like for us to do, we would try to find a way to do that. And we have Johnson Economics totally capable of doing that kind of, we call them indirect or induced benefits. We're trying to be very conservative here in what we're presenting. So in this business case, we didn't even assume that additional residential development would be catalyzed and then take credit for that economic development. We're only counting what happens on the properties that we control, but we full well know that a project of this magnitude would not only generate new housing development, but it would trigger commercial development as well. And there are indirect and induced jobs benefits and fiscal benefits and economic benefits. But we haven't tried to quantify them. And we're also doing this kind of on a shoestring as best we can. So if that was something the council wanted more information about, we know how to get it, but it's not currently in anybody's scope.
Kenny, I think we should probably at least understand how much that would cost to figure that out, because as we're having the conversations, I think to Councillor Shaw's point, as we're having those conversations in the community, it's one thing to say in 20 years it will have cost us $33 million less to do it this way, but it's a whole nother thing to say there's another $30 or $50 million of economic benefit that's indirect related to this.
Understood. We'll get that information.
Or whatever that number is. I mean, I just pulled that out of my hat, but.
Yes, I understand.
Thank you
Councilor
very much.
Shaw, anything else?
No, thank you.
All right. Councilor Goodhouse.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple questions, so I'll go kind of one by one. One you hinted on as far as mentioning the or went over through the presentation, the police security. How is that going to be separated on that diagram? I was just trying to look at that, but I know that right now we have the parking separate, but is there going to be separate parts of the building and separate parts that for parking that'll be police only? Because I presume that we'd have to have for in and out and use and have to have some of those parts separate. So
that was covered, right? Underneath the primary structure.
Yes, and Kent Larson, our architect from DLR Group, I think is still on the line, can give a quick reply to that, Councilor Goodhouse.
Yeah, it's a good question. So certainly the police functions, while they would share a building, would be separate, completely separate from a function and circulation standpoint for the appropriate security. You know, they'd be appropriately secured from a lobby. They'd be appropriately secured from other city spaces. You'd have to have credentials to go back and forth. And then the police fleet parking would be in the basement, which would be secure as well. So while they share a building, they would be completely zoned separately based on credentials and security and proper construction types to create that security.
Perfect. Thank you. I presume they were, but just in the presentation, it didn't really get that part.
Right. Yeah, that's down in the fun building design weeds that we're not quite there yet, but certainly that's the way it'll play out.
Oh yeah. And then the next question on the parking structure. I think before their earlier talks, we'd looked at maybe doing to the side, but that looks like it's behind it. Is that parking structure going to be something still with the position of it, still something that's easily accessible for evenings and weekends for other people for people to use? And if so, also will there be some kind of a payment structure set up where people that use that will either be free to the public, or is there going to be payment on that? And if so, will that go towards the cost of recouping anything for the city?
So I'll let Kent again speak to the siting of that structure. I think the short answer is yes, it'll be easily accessible to the public. At the moment, we are not modeling any revenues. We are imagining that for the first generation of use, and I don't know how many years that is, we still have free parking as an amenity downtown, just like you don't have to pay for an on-street space. But we all know that as downtowns mature, that changes. However, Councilor Goodhouse, on the financial plan, we're not counting any parking revenue, and that's a greater benefit to the public. But Kent, do you want to talk about the accessibility for the public to that structure, given where you've located it?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the short answer is that's where it fits. The second answer is the pedestrian connectivity on the site will be, I would say, appropriately developed so that there's ways to come and go both for vehicles and pedestrians to the west, to the south, and to the east. Obviously, you can't go to the north there with the tracks, but there's the nice pedestrian way along the green space along the tracks too to connect to on each end. And so definitely there'll be multiple ways to come and go on the site, both as pedestrians and with vehicles and bicycles.
Okay, great. And then is this still, are we still trying to aim for the end of this year, or what I maybe I missed that part. When are we aiming for putting this out to the ballot or going forward?
Yeah, our assumption would be November of this year. That's the best time for us to be able to keep the budget because of the time cost of money that Director LaFrance described. And also it's, you know, a general election in an odd number year. There are some who would say that is a fortuitous time to go, but more importantly, just because we need to not face 7% appreciation year after year, once we get into the summer and we come back to you this summer, we're going to know everything we feel like we need. We're not going to know everything about this project, but we feel like we will know enough for you to be able to refer something this summer for the voters to vote on this fall. That's what we're aiming for.
Okay, last comment, and this is kind of a comment, but as the mayor said, before previous ballot measures, even though we were waiting for the council to approve it, but whatever we can start doing for some kind of public outreach to at least just giving some of the grand scopes of it, and I'm sure everyone's kind of pretty politically savvy, but what I've learned, especially back years ago when there was the Y proposal, anytime there's any really grand renderings of something, that always kind of seems to distract the public. So if we could keep it to just general renderings of like a maybe bird's eye, but more talk about like the presentation said, cost savings, how we have the cost benefit as far as the aging infrastructure, what it's going to get, what the needs are. If we can talk more about the nuts and bolts, that's what I think residents usually tie into, rather than if you show up a big shiny thing. Every time I see any city that puts up something, then it's always the comments where you're building yourself a giant, Taj Mahal or something. But if we can talk about all these facts, that's what usually comes true. So I presume we're doing that, but I always want to remind that stay away from any grand renderings and talk, as soon as we can about, even just the basic needs of why we need this.
Yeah, that's the important communications aspect. Certainly, the messaging needs to be as you just described. Youth Councilor Calderon, questions?
Not a lot of questions, just more comments. I have to say this was the best presentation I've seen in my life. There were like 5 moments where I was like, oh my goodness, I have the best question to ask. Then the next slide you would answer it. So thanks for that. But then I just don't have any questions now. I find it ironic though that the part of the city that's used for technology was built in the 50s and is the oldest part of the building. Just the random thing is that I've also heard the strong want for a community room, so that's pretty cool that people are talking about that. And then just what other councilors have said about the strong messaging about how this is a really big need for the city and how this is truly going to be important moving forward. That's going to be the most important part of our communication with the public. So great job, guys. Thanks for the solid presentation. I'm truly blown away.
Council President Lube.
I also want to echo the presentation was great. Also, the information in the agenda was really thorough, so I really felt prepared coming in, and I didn't even have a whole lot of questions coming in, and most of the questions I had were answered in the presentation. The one question I do have, we've talked a lot about the potential funding in order to get this off of the ground and what the impact would be for, our community members, but I'm wondering on the flip side, say for instance this weren't to this doesn't move forward and we no longer have those bonds, but we still have $180 million, right, to pay for to upgrade our current building and rent and all of that. Like, I'm curious what that would look like as far as an impact on our community members, and how would that would differentiate from what building this would cost.
Are you, Council President Lube, are you asking about what it would look like in terms of numbers and actual dollar costs, or just how that scenario would play out?
I guess kind of both. I think in order to build this, there's a pretty clear plan that we're hoping to reuse the funds to continue the rate for what was the library. And there would probably be an additional $8 on the utility bills, so on and so forth. But if that were to expire, the payment source in order to pay for updating, the current buildings that would have no value at the end and all of the rent, like what would that situation look like as far as people's pockets differently? Would they end up having to pay more out of their utility funds rather than, on their real estate taxes? Like, what would that look like?
I mean, Council President Lube, I guess I'll jump in and just say, to begin with, what it looks like is at the end of 20 years, you've spent all this money and you don't have anything to, you don't have anything at the end of it. It's kind of like putting a new engine in a 1983 Honda Civic today. Like, why would you do that?
I'm not arguing that point. I'm simply asking what it would look like, or what, because this is not a guarantee. And so we need to be able to speak to what the alternative would look like.
Let me turn to Director LaFrance and see if he wants to take a stab at answering that.
Thank you, Director Asher. Council President Lube, so if I'm hearing you correctly, we've been working on how we would fund doing this city facilities consolidation. You would like to see us kind of do the same type of funding analysis on a status quo. Sort of when we looked at the business case, if we took the current business case, not the consolidated business case, how would we go about funding the current business case? Is that essentially what you're looking for?
Yes, we don't need to get down to like pennies and those sorts of things. I'm just looking big picture. Where would the buckets of money be for, that $180 million versus what you've already allocated for the new facility?
Okay, absolutely. We can work on that.
And Toby, if the answer is that's impossible, that's probably an okay answer too. I mean, because I'm just thinking about all the sources of revenue that you wouldn't have if you went that direction. So
to be clear, that's also kind of my point, right? Like, what would we have the funding in order to be able to do this? The answer is quite possibly no.
Yeah, I just don't want to send Toby out on a task that quite possibly may be impossible, and we recognize that now. But if it is possible, it'd be instructive to Council President Loob's point. Councilor Goodhouse.
I like what Council President Loob said. I think that's a good comparison. And I always like the images you can have side by side. It would be something where you can almost list, here's everything we need to do on an aging infrastructure. No funding source found or picked out. And here's what we need to do for a proper facility that fits us. And here's the funding sources, so people can see an easy format where, hey, we have to do all this. We can't afford it. We don't have any funding source yet. We can do this and provide what we need for the community. It might just be a good comparison to show that, we can't really maintain what we have, and it's not even needed, or not needed, but not functional compared to what is functional and serves all the needs and will go forward. As the mayor said, it might even be a great kind of a little image of, why put any money into this car that doesn't even fit anymore? Maybe it's a 2-seater car and you have a family of 5, but you're still dumping money into it, but it doesn't even fit your family of 5, but you're still putting money into it as opposed to that. So I think that's a great visual and a great way to easily show to the public what we need and how we can do it. And we don't really have a funding source, and other things may need to be taken away of to pay for something that doesn't even work for us anymore.
So we have kind of transitioned, without me formally doing it, transitioned from questions to comments. And I've allowed that, which is, I'm fine with it, but I just want to recognize that. I have a couple of comments I'll make. One is that from my perspective, I think trying to explain this to the majority of voters with a tax increase when we don't have to do that is something that I think would be very ill-advised. I think we need to figure out from a political standpoint and from a funding standpoint how to do this project without trying to message that. I think Councilor Newton had raised that question earlier. I just think for me and what I know about our community, that's kind of a non-starter. So just my comment there. And then the other thing I just want to point out is that as I think about what this project could do to both solving problems and improving our downtown, this could be the most transformational project that happens in our community in our lifetimes. And I think we should recognize that and be thinking about it that way. It will be transformational if it happens. Other comments? We can start back around with, well, why don't you let me know if you want to speak. We don't necessarily have to go all the way around if everybody's said their piece. Councilor Newton.
Yeah, just briefly, I was, and I think you were there, Mr. Mayor, too. I think it was either 2015 or 2016 when Director Robinson and Facilities Manager Cole delivered the word about our facilities and what it was going to take to repair them. And I sort of panicked. So I think this is really an important project from that standpoint. Our police facilities are so inadequate and in such need of repair that, I'm supportive of that as well. the thing that it's resonating with people that I talk to in the community. They're really resonating with the idea of right sizing and not the idea of being overcrowded. It's like, well, that just doesn't, they don't gravitate to that. But when we talk about right sizing and some of the things that are happening in the work world now because of COVID and how the way the city delivers services, it's been since 1986 we opened those buildings. The way we provide services is different, and the people I talk to can acknowledge that, and so they get the fact that you may have increases in staffing in some areas and people doing work differently. So if right sizing means we need more staff, that message seems to resonate better. So I guess I will say I support moving forward. My issue is always community engagement, and I'm wondering if a lot of the people we've talked to are fairly knowledgeable in the community. When I did all the calls I made for the police levy, I had to play catch up with a lot of people who were just voters, but not really that aware of how things work. So that's why I brought up the issue of, do people really understand the need, which is great, and the idea about how we would fund that. Kristen, I think her name was, said, people in Tigard are pretty practical. So I think once you can make a case, we have a great community, but I am a little bit concerned that the timeline is so tight. We're going to be kind of playing catch up with people to help them connect the absolute need with how we're looking at addressing this need. And, oh, by the way, in the Tigard Way, it's an incredible opportunity, as the mayor just said, for a lot of other great things to happen. The last thing I will say is I am, as I think Councillor Goodhouse raised, I'm a little bit concerned at this point about the community getting super involved in the actual facility and getting their feedback on that. Feels like the messaging might be getting a little complicated in the time period we have, but that's just a thought. So I'm supportive of moving forward for the reasons I stated, and I hope we can really make the community engagement simple and understand we've got some people in our community who are very unaware and some people who are more involved in committees, and they're just businesses that are involved with us, and they're going to be farther along in terms of how all this would work. So thanks, Mr. Mayor.
All right, other council comments? Council President Lube.
I think it's exciting. We're getting into the weeds and the details, which I think is fantastic, but also to step back and really think of the impact that this project is going to have in so many different ways it's really cool. So I hope we continue to move forward, and you have my support.
Councillor Shaw.
Great, thank you, Mayor. I too think this project is going to be transformational. I think the return on investment, future years, and what it can bring back to the community is huge, and look forward to seeing what those numbers are. And then I too support coming back with the formal budget for the next or the third feasibility study. Thank you.
And it sounds like, I know we haven't specifically addressed this, but I think it's implied in what everybody's saying is that we need to fund or expect the funding request for the $150,000 to move the work forward. Anybody have concerns with that or thumbs ups? Okay. All right. So, Mr. Asher, we're kind of getting wound up with council comments, questions, and you've now just gotten that set of positive feedback on that funding request that would be coming before the council. What other issues have we not addressed tonight or responded to?
We've addressed them all, and thank you for all the kudos. You can tell that we've been working really hard, both on collecting the information and also on presenting it. It's always nice to be when that works. What I guess if I get a last word, what I want to emphasize is that this project is far enough along now where I think your project team, is really thinking about you, the council, as part of that team. And we want you to think about this the same way, because we actually can't carry the ball over the goal line here. That's going to have to be as much your work as ours. So if you will stay engaged with us individually through the city manager, through the mayor, to continue to ask questions, continue to make this a smarter, better project and process, we're going to be okay. I think we can get this done. But when we come back,
we're on the team, Kenny. We're on the team.
When we come back to you in the summer, hopefully in June, maybe early July, we're going to give you a number. It's the number that we think we need to ask the voters to approve. It's the number that's going to be able to actually get this project done. And then into the summer and early fall, it's going to be about talking to the whole community about this. And I think when the community understands this opportunity, both solving problems and creating the downtown that everybody wants and the housing that we all need, I think Tigard's going to be here for this project, and I agree it's going to be transformational. So thank you very much for the support thus far and for being on the team going forward.
And Kenny, the other point I would make about what you just said is that it's also about what our alternative choices are as a community, and frankly, by not acting, what the default choice is, which is sort of what Councillor Shaw a moment ago asked Mr. LaFrance to put together, which may not really be a viable thing. So I think that's an important part of the messaging. Councillor Goodhouse?
I might just be a little bit of a stickler on this. So just to clarify, what is our communication strategy between now and summer and having the final numbers? My only worry is just that what I keep hearing is that starting summer, maybe June, we'll start, or after that, June or July, start really hitting the message. But to me, that seems just from past, okay.
No, we have a press release that's drafted for tonight. We have a website that's going live tonight. We're going to hit the community starting tomorrow with your approval. I'm just saying that by the time you have to make a binding decision about an election, a lot of people will know and understand this project, and we will be moving into a mode of hopefully bringing people around to voting yes come this summer.
And Councillor Goodhouse,
that's why I just wanted to clarify that was just worrying me, because 4 or 5 months to really get that all together was worrying me. So that's why I wanted to clarify.
Well, and Councillor Goodhouse, I think it's important to recognize the staff are talking about the city's component of this, but the political component of it and a potential campaign is stuff we need to work on, and we should be politically, the council should be working on soon, not in September, probably. To your point.
That was exactly my point. And also how to craft it with COVID, saying, we may be planning this during COVID times, but it's, maybe a smaller scale of where you plant a tree that you may never be underneath. In a sense, we're planning for something that's going to be worked on or done after COVID times. So.
All right. Anything else further from the council or from staff? All right. Let's see. We had no non-agenda.
Thank you so much.
We had no non-agenda items. We'll move on to administrative report. If we have one tonight. Interim City Manager.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, we do have an administrative report. So again, thank you all for your time and discussion tonight. We talked about some really big efforts underway that will not only impact the city of Tigard in the next 2 years, but potentially in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So the word transformation is very apropos. So just providing a few updates of what we're doing today, as well as tomorrow. Wanted to let you know that the second round of RAFT applications is now live. We've started doing outreach and contacting various nonprofits. We will be awarding 4 organizations grants of $25,000 each to provide needed services for the community. Downtown, the Main Street banner has been updated, so we're continuing to encourage our community to shop downtown and shop local. Wanted to give you an update on the library. The library is working on their own strategic plan, so they are seeking community input. A community survey has been posted on their website, both in Spanish and English, and already 400 people have responded and shared their feedback. So this strategic plan process will help Tigard establish priorities and set direction for the next 3 years. and they are already taking steps to ensure that this plan aligns with the refreshed strategic plan as well as your council goals, and I know you'll be working on those in the coming weeks and months. Tax season, as we know, 2021, beginning of the year, which means tax season is quickly approaching us, and the library is preparing resources to help community members access all the tools that they need, such as the 1040 combined forms and instruction booklets, as well as the state of Oregon W-2 forms. And just because of COVID-19 restrictions, the volunteer AARP tax preparers who often are at the library helping patrons will not be available this year, so plan accordingly. Wanted to give just a mention, the officer-involved shooting that occurred on January 6th is very much top of mind. Wanting to continue operating openly. The only update I have on that is we have received no update from Washington County DA's office, but the minute we learn something, you'll learn something and the community will also learn something. So we are paying attention, and even though we're not talking about it, it doesn't mean we're not thinking about it. So lastly, I want to take a moment and welcome Eduardo Ramos. Today was his first day in the city management office as our management analyst, and we are thrilled to have him. And he's already got a lot of ideas that he's shared in check-ins. So one of the things he'll be doing is being the point of contact for the Public Safety Advisory Board. And just mentioning, once again, that is such a phenomenal group. They're really an inspirational group that talks openly and is really empathetic. And their next meeting is next Monday, January 25th. So that's the announcements that I have for tonight's meeting. And thank you again for some really great conversation about the issues presented tonight. Very appreciated.
Thank you, Interim Chief.
Of course.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to thank Ms. Nyland for giving us the update, giving the update to the community on the officer-involved shooting. Even though you don't have information, I think it's important for us to continue to communicate with the community on where we are in that. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Of course, of course, of course.
All right. We do not have an executive session scheduled, so I will ask for a motion for adjournment.
I move to adjourn.
I'll second the motion.
Been moved and seconded. City Recorder, please conduct a roll call vote.
Councilor Shaw.
Yes.
Mayor Snyder.
Yes.
Councilor Goodhouse.
Yes.
Councilor Newton.
Yes.
Council President Liu.
Yes.
All right, we are adjourned. Good night, Tigard.